I mean, when I was first cast, I had, a couple of my girlfriends call me and say, "You're working with Clint Eastwood. You're working with Clint Eastwood. Can I come visit you?" um, it was, I mean, you had my guy friends and my father, of course, would, beside themselves. I still don't think my father's ever come down from the fact that I've worked with Clint Eastwood. So, um, but it was very exciting and fun to have these calls from, my female friends who, "You're going to work with Clint, you're going to be in a Dirty Harry movie. That is so cool." But yeah, and I get stopped on the street as much by women as by men for being, people say, "You're Deadpool." And it's, it's women, a lot of women. So, but yeah, I think, women like Dirty Harry. Are you kidding me? I made this film, it was out, 11 years ago? 12 years ago, maybe? Was it out in and, I still get stopped wherever I go. I was in London and got stopped. I've been, I was in Hungary, shooting a film. And the people in the hotel, I don't think they'd probably never seen me in anything else, but they knew me from the Deadpool. And this was this tiny, tiny little town in outside Budapest, but little tiny town in Hungary. So yes, of course, it's been very helpful.
I started in Clint's company in 1975 on The Outlaw Josie Wells as an assistant editor. I worked with Ferris Webster throughout that film, and during the post-editing of it up in Carmel, Clint's and my relationship started to come together. I never met him before we started shooting the film, so I met him at the end in the post-editing area. And at the end of that film, we came back to Los Angeles to do all our work, our final work. I did all the post-editing with Clint by myself because Ferris had gotten sick and gone to the hospital, and I did all the actual final editing of the film. And during that process, his relationship with me grew very close, and he liked me, liked my work, and he realized I could brought something to his company that he hadn't had in that area as an assistant. And on the next picture, which we started in 1976, which was The Enforcer, I was made co-editor. And from that point on, almost all the films that Clint has done, I've been co-editor, editor since then. It's amazing because, Dirty Hair, I saw one of them the other night on television, and I think it has to do with Clint. His persona on screen. I think the audience really has followed his career from when he started way back in some of his early shows before he even got to Rawhide. And then we got to what they call the spaghetti westerns, the great three westerns that were done in Italy. His character just came along, and we, the society, kind of grew along with him. And he brought something every time so real. And that's what he does in a film. He tries to make his films as if they were really happening and was about real people and real life rather than some far-fetched thing that, we might fantasize about how good it might be, but the truth is we're never going to achieve that or see that because it's out of reality. And his films are about reality. When I started working on The Enforcer, I could see that Clint playing Harry Callahan, and I'd seen the two previous shows, Dirty Harry and Magnum Force. He brought, I think at that time in life, when you go back to that period in the 70s, he brought the evolution of the police officer in a different direction. Society changed, but he was this officer that was not anti-establishment, but realized that what I believe the criminal, the way society was going, having more rights than the person that was hurt, or we started to get away from it back in the 70s. It seemed like justice wanted to go that think about the rights of the felon and not the rights of the victim. And his character, I thought, really set that up and brought that forth. That I think the public really enjoyed that. Maybe the politicians didn't, and maybe some part of society didn't like that. But the truth was, he brought to the public, and that's why they rallied around it, an officer who was about the truth.
Well, actors directing themselves goes back a long way. Goes back into some of the two real westerns that were made years ago, William S. Hart and various people. And I think then, of course, Orson Welles made a big impact with his Citizen Kane. A lot of people up through the years have done it, and some people quite successfully and some not. The actors should convert to directing very well because they've spent all their life on the sets and they know kind of the workings and they know what it takes, what the job of most crew members are. And so they should make the transition very well. Sometimes it's a little difficult doing both jobs because you have to be able to switch your mind from the setup and the framing and the whole overlook of the film and then jump into it at the same time, so you're jumping right into the center of it. But with me, I did it as a necessity because when I Play Misty, for me, if I was in it, I could get the film made. Before that, it was sitting on the shelf at Universal, and so so I asked them if I could direct it, and they said sure. They said, we don't particularly want to pay you for it though, so, but that was fine. I told my agent, Leonard Hershan, I said they shouldn't really have to pay me. I'd pay them for the opportunity. However, he negotiated a deal where they gave just a percentage, and the percentage turned out to be quite good because the film didn't cost very much, so it managed to break even and go on. But it's a difficult job. I don't recommend it, and I've always threatened to not do it. I've always threatened. I said, well, I'll do this one more time, and then I'll either direct or act. But the one more time always ended up being another, and then another, or I couldn't get the director I wanted, and then I thought I brought in somebody I didn't know. You're sort of stuck with their concept, and if their concept doesn't agree with yours, then you're stuck with that. So. On some projects, you just do it yourself, and other projects that you get a director and let them take the grief. People still now, once in a while, people say, "Wait, why don't you do another Dirty Harry?" But wait a second now, he's a different guy, and what would I be doing? Would I be out there fly fishing or something like that? And then some case comes along, he's retired from the force, of course, long retired, and get in some incident. I guess that could be feasible, but I don't see it, and I've never had a writer come up with an idea that was at least a bit provocative, and sometimes it's best to leave a good thing alone. Sometimes you relate back and say, well, that was enough of that. I didn't intend to do a series of sequels. When I did Every Which Way But Loose years later, I never intended to do a sequel to that. And when I did Fistful of Dollars, I never intended to do sequels to that, but they just kind of came about. But at the stage I am now and the type of things I've been doing in the last decade or so, other than doing a genre repeat, such as Unforgiven, where you revisit a genre that you've had some success with, I don't necessarily like to go back to the same characters anymore. The characters, as you portray them, you try to portray them as honestly as you can. And because in a film, in any drama, whether it's a film or a play or what have you, even liars think they're right. So everybody, the antagonist thinks he's right. The villain in a piece thinks he's right. Oh, well, society didn't treat me right, so that's why I'm doing this. That's the way it is in real life. It's just people do that. It's much akin to, we see it happening all the time now because we live in this era of blaming everybody for everything, and that kind of goes along with that. It's like if a bartender's working for you and he steals from the employer, it's, oh, well, I bring a lot of people in here. I'm important to the business. So he's dishonest, but he's rationalized in his mind that he's done a great deed for his dishonesty. And that kind of goes about with any story. You approach a story much like real life. You try to tell it whether you're playing, whoever you're playing in it, you try to make him as honest a character, as real life a character as possible.
But one thing I knew, when I got this job, I was secretly very happy about one thing. I knew that I would finally be in a movie that people would see. I knew one thing was sure. This was a movie everybody was going to see and say, hey, I saw you in the movie, you know. People next door, you know, the group, obviously, you know, they were sort of, you know, more, the audience was more specialized. But this one, everybody was going to see.
The martial arts that I did in the role, some of it was in the script. I don't think, if I remember correctly, it wasn't quite as extensive as what we ended up doing. Buddy Van Horn, who directed it, came up to me and asked me, well, son, you know, do you want to do your own stunts? And I said, yeah. And he goes, well, can I see what you do? And I said, yeah. And what we did is that we went off with the stuntman, and he let me alone with the stuntman for about, I think we rehearsed 40 minutes and came up with a whole run. And Buddy looked at it and smiled and said, yeah, we'll do that. Okay, in fact, let's expand it. So, you know, the fight scene was expanded to accommodate a lot more. I think originally he was just supposed to knock the guy out, but it turned into be a little bit more, you know. And so, in fact, I think, if I remember correctly, what we shot, I think almost 80% of it made it in. Some of it was a little excessive. I mean, we had, like, you know, guys going through windows and things like that, and it got to be a little too much like a kung fu movie, which wasn't the intent of it. When I was going to be his partner, I went and got some earlier versions of the Dirty Harry. In fact, the first two, I think, that originally came out, to see what the partners were going to be like. And when I saw the kind of role that the partner played, I said, okay, yeah, this will work. I can do this. And then I remember seeing, during that time, I also remember I went and saw Bullet again, Steve McQueen's film, you know, and where, you know, there was a partner in that film. I thought, okay, well, I kind of have an idea of how to play a partner. When I got the script again, I was really surprised because it was pretty obvious that they were writing a character that really hadn't been seen a lot, you know, in Dirty Harry films before. And so I just, you know, I went with the script, basically, and the way that Clint wanted to play it is that this guy just, you know, he knew about Dirty Harry and he was really scared of dying. And he didn't mind showing it, you know, and he was going to do it, you know, his whole thing was to survive the gig.
This is a .44 Magnum, as you know, the most powerful handgun in the world. Not anymore, but it was then. And it has fired neither 5 nor 6 because it's empty. And this is one of the original guns from the movie. And when I did the second movie, I said, I want one of those guns. Can't you get the prop department to steal one of those guns and give it to me? So Clint and Warner Brothers publicity guy arranged to get that, and they put a plaque on it and everything. So it's a very valuable gun now, and it's become an icon. Anytime you make a movie, there's lots of scene changes. And if the director wanted to and said, I'm going to do your script exactly the way it's written, which I do when I direct one of my scripts, obviously when you're there on the spot, you're going to change things. You're going to find things that are better and worse, and the actors are going to say different things, and so there's going to be a lot of changes and stuff like that. And people always say, well, what part is your original? I said, all the parts you liked. Clint Eastwood is very, very much that way, very quiet, very, no big deal, very unpretentious. There's no, everything is straight up, just what it is. I am sure that he had no trouble all of his life in dealing with fans or anything like that, because he probably changed very little as time went on. He's basically the same guy now that I knew back then, And he's a very good person. He's a very generous person. He's one of the few actors that if you call him up, he'll always call you back in an hour or two. And I've made movies that are that other actors who are famous actors, their best movies. And if I call them up, they'll say, what does he want? I better check. None of that with Clint. Clint's right up there, and everybody admires him, because of that. He has those old, almost Midwest values. My, kind of input into the character came from a number of things. I knew a cop who was kind of a Dirty Harry type cop, and he'd shot quite a number of people. He was a Long Beach detective, and he said always, when I'm put on the case, the verdict is in. And he didn't usually bring the people back, and he was a real classic kind of character, because he was more out of L.A. Confidential than Dirty Harry. But he was an interesting guy because he, in his part-time, was a dog trainer, and he was very gentle in training the dogs. And he believed that you had to be very gentle in training dogs, but he was not gentle with human beings,
Well, there is a similarity, and they all stood up for justice, and their heroic action was rooted in that. It's as simple as that. There's nothing complicated about it. People like heroes, and people like, provided you don't you don't make it, you don't shove it down their throats in a very obvious way. You do show that there are the weaknesses in the hero as well, that he has to in some way conquer or work with or accept or in some way prevent from controlling him, etc. And once you have that inner conflict revealed while he's trying to accomplish his mission, you have a very acceptable human being there functioning. Try to do right, even though at times it would conflict with the law. I remember getting a very interesting shot of the three heads of the motorcyclists looking at Clint, at that very tight raking angle, and Clint said, "Boy, that's a great angle." I said, "Oh, it is?" Well, it was just a matter of showing how intense they were about getting their point across and how united they were in standing for that position, which was pretty anti-democratic.
In the scene in Kezar Stadium where Dirty Harry is chasing the killer and the killer is crossing the football field and he won't stop and Dirty Harry shoots him. And I said, listen, why don't we do it this way? When the guy gets hit, he gets hit in the leg like an animal getting hit. I'll do this front flip and fall. And Siegel says to me in that wonderfully wonderful way he had. He said, so you can do a front flip? And I said, yeah. So he says, all right, everybody, you know, and he gathers the entire crew around. He says, the New York actor here is going to do a front flip for us. So I'm surrounded by the entire crew. And he says, okay, do it. And I said, oh, come on. He says, no, I'm going to set this shot up for you. I want to make sure that you can do it. So I did it. When we were shooting the Mount Davidson scene, at this point in the picture, Siegel was giving me free license just to ad-lib stuff and to work off my stream of consciousness, which I was. And at the point where the killer is getting Dirty Harry, he's got him up against the cross, and he tells him, all right, now remove your gun very slowly. And of course, Clint pulls out that big mother of a gun. And I ad-libbed this line, my, that's a big one. And the crew fell on the ground. I mean, it just destroyed the shot. They had to reset it, but they all loved the line, so the line stayed in, which I'm very glad. Along with Hubba, 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 Fascist Pig, and a bunch of other immortal ones.
First of all, you have to understand that Clint Eastwood was like my inspiration. I remember when I think about it, when I came to this country, there was like, you know, John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, Kirk Douglas. There was like 2-3 guys like that I really admired, and I wanted to have a career like them. And Clint was one of those guys that I always thought, even from the westerns that he has done before Dirty Harry, you know, that I want to be like him. I want to have this kind of a career, to this kind of movies. So obviously, he had already an impact on me, that he was the motivating force for me to come to America and to get into acting in the first place. So obviously, when you then see your idol coming up with a movie like Dirty Harry and creating a whole new standard in action movies, and also to do it with a certain style, and the way he played it with a certain, you know, characteristics and lines that were memorable lines, I said to myself, that's what I have to do. I have to go after those kind of movies. And so for me, there was a motivating force to get into action movies. If it was first the Conan movies, and then later on in the Terminator and Commando, and play cops and in Red Heat and all those things. So he was definitely my motivation, and was the idol. And that's what I wanted to accomplish. Well, I think that Clint showed us clearly that when you want to do an action movie and really portray a guy in an interesting way, you should make him multi-dimensional. You shouldn't make just the guy be a straight cop. That doesn't work. I mean, we have seen that too many times on TV shows and all that. But what works is to play around with the character in such a way, like he does, very soft-spoken. He never screamed like you normally see when people play cops. You know, it's doing all the screaming and all the fuss and acting totally out of control a lot of times. He didn't do that. He was, like I said, very calm. He was eating his sandwich or his hamburger. He was pulling out the gun, and he was doing his job. That's what he was doing. And then every time he talked to anyone, anytime he negotiated, anytime he dealt with anyone, everything was in a very calm way. And I think because he acted so calm and he said lines that were quite humorous, it became really hysterical for people. You could laugh in his movies, you could sit there and be entertained like in a comedy sometimes, and at the same time 2 seconds later be totally scared and frightened because he got very intense. So he gave you kind of a multi-dimensional character, which I think worked really well and became the new standard for action movies and for those kind of films.
You know, I think the thing I remember most about Clint Eastwood is that a year or so later, I hadn't yet had a lot of success, and I was still a struggling actor in Hollywood. And I was going on readings, and of course, he had his company over at Warner Brothers, the Malpazzo Company. And I was going to the Warner Brothers lot to audition for some part in something. I can't remember what it was. And I had my script and I had worked on it for days, and I was on one side of the street on the lot walking to the interview, and on the other side of the street was Clint and Ted Post, who directed a lot of those early movies. And I kind of glanced over and thought, oh my God, it's Clint, you know. And I was still very impressed by him and intimidated by him a little bit. And I looked over, and I don't know if he saw me or not, but he kind of looked over and then crossed. I didn't even think he would remember me. He crossed the street and came up to me. He said, "Hi, Bob. How you doing? How's it going?" And I thought, Clint Eastwood is the greatest guy on the planet. He's the greatest guy in the world. And he remembered me from that small role in Magnum Force, you know. And he was off doing other big movies. And so that's one of my, maybe the most important memory I had of Clint Eastwood in that time of my life. And certainly the role that I played in Vegas, the Dantana character, was influenced by all that really cool sort of low, whispery kind of delivery of a line that Clint made famous. And you know, in a real situation, my voice goes up about 10 octaves, you know, and I start panicking. But that streetwise guy that he created and that coolness was part of all those characters. And there's a sequence at the end of the pilot of the Vegas show that I did where I stalk a bad guy. And he goes, "Who are you?" And I say, "I'm the Lone Ranger. I'm the Captain Video. I'm coming after you, and I'm going to nail you." And it was all that, I was doing Clint. And they tested the pilot. They saw that scene, and they said, "That's a series." And every episode after that, they created some scene like that. Because when they tested it, that's when the arrow started going way, way up. That cool kind of low delivery. Thank you, Clint.